So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Ask YP Now show. So, this is a show focusing on positive living, work life balance, living with a passion, success in your life and your business, and most important of all, to make the world a better place. And this evening, we have with us, Joseph. Joseph's come all the way from Malta. So, Joseph, why would you say hi to the audience and introduce yourself?
Hello, and thank you, YP, for having me on your show.
My
Um,
pleasure.
so, introduce myself. I take it you want me to explain who I am.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, well, I've been living in Malta for the last 8 years, originally from Canada, born and raised there, and just was looking for a change. And we just moved to Canada with my wife and daughter. And since then, I've started up my own consulting business where basically I focus on inclusion and diversity for the neurodiverse talent in the workplace, as well as entrepreneurs, and creating a better, more inclusive environment where neurodiverse individuals can excel in their areas of strengths.
Okay. When you use the word neurodiversity, and so on, I think and that includes me, for a portion of people, we don't really understand what the word neurodiverse or neurodiversity is. Can you just share a bit more about what it is?
Sure. Well, let's take a look at the origin of the term itself. Neurodiversity was coined by Jody Singer in 1997 when she
Mhm.
was writing a thesis paper to understand her family history with neurodiversity. Because you see, her mother, herself, and her daughter are autistic. And
Okay.
the definition of neurodiversity is changing how society perceives the neurodiverse. Now,
Mm.
since then, the umbrella for neurodiversity has greatly expanded to include different and other types of neurodiversity. So now, when we talk about neurodiversity, we're talking about learning difficulties, educational challenges, or my favorite, the invisible disability. You can't see my disability. So it makes it very hard for you to relate or to empathize. And in addition to that, when we talk about learning difficulties or neurodiversity now, we're also talking about dyslexia, ADHD, dyscalculia, Tourette's, um, sorry, uh, autism, and dyspraxia. So those
Okay.
are the types of neurodiversities, and the umbrella has expanded to.
So, what do you think have brought about, this awareness? I think in the older days you would say that people see that as a disadvantage, isn't it?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
we have to understand how society is, and now we're talking about in regards to different types of thinking as well as systems. So let's
Mm-hmm.
first tackle the different types of thinking. When we talk about neurodiversity, you know, the first type of thinking is that it's a disability. All right.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because society has been built around one type of diversity, neurotypical, or what has been deemed as normal. Well, what is
Okay.
normal? And when you
Mm.
have a society built around one types of diversity, anything that is outside of that diversity is considered to be a disability. So
Okay.
now it comes down to the second aspect is it disability or is it a different way of thinking?
Mm-hmm.
So when we take a look at evolution and science, they have shown us that somewhere along the line we had neurotypical people who were considered to be generalists, and then
Mm-hmm.
somewhere along the line we needed to have specialists, and that's where the neurodiversity started to come into play. So
Okay.
when we take a look at Steve Jobs, for example, or Elon Musk, or even Albert Einstein, who or
Mm.
Thomas Edison, who was dyslexic. These are all individuals who have specialized because of their neurodiversity and have been able to think outside of the box because they think differently because of
Oh,
their
okay.
different approach of diversity. And it's also
Mm.
kind of interesting as well when we take a look at studies that have been done recently in regards to tribes that are still out there.
Mm-hmm.
They have found that, for example, those with ADHD tend to be better hunters and gatherers.
Oh,
So
yeah.
when we take a look at certain industries, for example, let's say this,
Mm-hmm.
the marketing and creative industry, You have a lot of dyslexics, whether because of their neurodiversity and also because of where they position themselves, tend to be more creative.
Okay. So then there's this thought that in a typical education system where they only look at a specific range or band of skills and they stereotype people within that narrow band and so on, that is creating a lot more, I would say, stress for the people that don't follow along this band, isn't it? Do you feel that there's something that's going on in our education system overall to raise this awareness?
Well, that's a very good question, and you've given a very good analogy. Again, it comes back when we take a look at different types of thinking scenario that I just gave, and that comes back to how the system has been developed. So when the system has been developed around one type of person, then obviously it hasn't been designed for other types of people. So when we take a look at the education system has been geared towards mainly neurotypical people. So they don't have the skills, and they haven't, unfortunately, properly adapted the system to properly recognize and to provide adequate support or to focus on the strengths of neurodiverse students. So unfortunately, when we take a look at the education system, we can't blame teachers because the teachers are the product of the system. And we can't necessarily blame psychologists because the psychologists are a product of the system. When we take a look at a certain percentage who get identified and a certain percentage who don't get identified, it's a crapshoot, unfortunately, because the system wasn't designed to recognize and to provide adequate support for students. So you're seeing a certain percentage get identified, and you're seeing a certain percentage don't. So, for example, when we take a look at women, for example, women are 73%, or young girls, should I say, who then later become women, are 73% more unlikely to be undiagnosed with autism and ADHD. So we're starting to see women late in life, in their 30s to 40s and 50s, having late diagnosis with either being autistic or ADHD. We can say the same thing with people of color, unfortunately, because of stereotypes and because of the system as well. A huge portion of the people of color or even people of Asian descent are also not getting diagnosed and being missed, and having later life diagnosis.
So I'm curious, Joseph, when you mentioned about this later diagnosis, but what actually triggers, a event or a circumstances where a parent or a child or somebody feels, hey, I need to be diagnosed,
Yeah, that's another good question. I mean, there are definitely signs to look out for, and there are definitely signs. I mean, we're not going to get into for each neurodiversity because it all varies and all differs. I mean, what we have to take a look at the aspect YP is that when we take a look at neurodiversity, they all tend to have similar strengths and similar challenges. And one of the main areas of where it affects individuals who are neurodiverse is cognitive function. So, but before I get to that, let's tackle, for example, dyslexia. So let's say everybody who understands dyslexia tends to think of obviously the extreme case that people that young kids or younger or adults can't read and they're flipping the letters or numbers, which is true, but that's an extreme level. Then there are those who have, either mid-level or lower level of dyslexia. So I technically I say with quotations, fall on the lower end of dyslexia. However, I will argue that I'm greatly affected in other ways. So when we take a look at the lower end of dyslexia, I can read, but I read much slower, and I sometimes have issues with comprehension. Math, for example, for me can be very difficult, where numbers do get kind of switched around, especially when we're doing algebra. I can write perfectly fine, but grammar and spelling is just out the door. So there is an example of where it's not, for me, it's not an extreme case of dyslexia. For me, it's a different kind of how I'm affected with my dyslexia. So I can read and I can write, but I'm affected differently. Now, when we go back to cognitive function, one of the people don't realize is how greatly affected neurodiversity affects cognitive function. So what is cognitive function? Cognitive function, we all have it, and there are different elements to that. So for example, if we take a look at executive function is the brain's management and planning system. So science has shown us once again that for majority of the population, executive function isn't fully developed until the age of 25. However, for neurodiverse individuals, it may take much longer or not at all. So how does that affect me? It affects my time management, it affects my ability to plan, because again, it's the brain's planning and management system. So that's one aspect of how I'm affected. Then there, of course, there's working memory. So working memory is how we're able to recall information and be able to understand information and know where to place that information. So for example, it's like I have difficulty following instructions. So let's say, for example, you asked me to organize papers and file them. So I would organize the papers, but then forget to file them. All right. So and a good analogy I like to use in that regards is I want you to think of two computers. One computer has 600 megabytes of RAM. It can run multiple windows. It can open multiple programs. It can juggle and make coffee all at the same time. Now, I want you to imagine a second computer that only has 4 gigabytes of RAM, meaning it can only run one window at a time, one program at a time. Anything beyond that, they get overwhelmed or could crash. So we need to chunk the information. We need to space out the information so that individual can function and process. Then there's the aspect of processing speed, for example. Now, processing speed is the ability to be able to receive information and to be able to respond to it in a fast manner. Now, there are those who have fast processing speed, and there are those who have slow processing speed. Now, there's a myth that those with fast processing speed are seen with a higher IQ. But studies have shown us that when you compare slow and fast together, they're at the same IQ level. Just the difference is that those with fast processing speed are able to respond to information faster. So imagine this case. A teacher asks a student in the classroom, what is 6 times 6? And before you could answer, little Jimmy in the back or Jasmine in the back has already spitted out the answer. That student obviously has fast processing speed, whereas you have slow processing speed. That means that you need time to be able to receive the information. You need time to be able to process an information, and then you need time to be able to answer or respond to that information. So those are 3 examples of how cognitive function is affected by neurodiversity. So this affects, so when we look at signs, we're looking at time management issues. We're looking at not being able to prioritize. We're looking at where they put their attention too much in one area over another. We're looking at the aspect where they may have trouble remembering or following instructions. These are some of the signs to look out for. And again, it's important to point out at this point that neurodiversity affects everyone differently. My life experience is completely different than someone else's life experience. And as well, as I mentioned earlier, there are degrees. You're going to have your Elon Musks of the world, you're going to have your data entry people, and you're going to have your people who are car washers. What is important is that we don't allow human potential to be wasted. We need to focus on individual strengths and to be able to support their challenges. And that's where we come back to the system. The system needs to adjust and adapt to those individuals.
So how would so coming back to the corporate world, so how would a company then I suppose there's two questions to this. The first thing is that how can a company be neurodiverse? And second thing is how can a company, embrace neurodiversity to its advantage, right? So these are two separate questions, I guess.
Okay, well, let's take a look at a couple things here because there's a bit of a caveat.
Okay.
First off, neurodiversity, inclusion and diversity in general, can be applied to any business, to any size. Too often there's the myth that, especially when we talk about micro or SMEs, they feel that they're too small, that they may not have the full resources versus, let's say, IBM or Microsoft. But however, though, when you take a look at the principles of inclusion and diversity, it doesn't matter the size. It just comes down to the willingness for you to act and adapt to that situation. So now let's take a look at the situation with the pandemic. The pandemic has actually shined a really huge light on business in general, that the way business has been operating for the last few decades hasn't been operating properly. The system is out of date. So we need to change the system. We need to transform the system to include these principles to become more inclusive. So how can you become more inclusive? Well, let's take a look at the system. I'm going to mention Simon Preston, who I just met with yesterday. He's a fellow neurodiversity colleague in the UK, and he was talking about systems. And he already gave a really great analogy that I'm going to borrow from him, which is when we take a look at football, the game, the strategy that's being deployed by a team, they're following a system. And in that system, it's not about an individual. It's about how the team works well together.
Okay.
So you create the environment and a strategy of how that team can work really well together. So when you watch a football game, you can see the players and that system flowing up and down the field. So when the ball moves forward, the forward moves forwards, and the defense moves into the proper position. When the ball moves back, everybody moves back and the defense moves into the proper position. If one defense player falls behind, a forward comes running to replace and to support the defense. If the goalkeeper gets confused all of a sudden from where the ball is, a defense player quickly comes in and acts as a goalkeeper. So you have this system flowing. So when we take that analogy, we need to take that analogy and find the right strategies and approach to apply to business. So where are your team flowing? How can we help your team flow more smoothly, more correctly? It's not about one employee not performing effectively. It's whether or not are we supporting that employee? Are we focusing on that employee's strengths? It's not about making that employee adapt to us. It's more about how can we as a company adapt to that employee. Again, working as a team, finding that cohesiveness. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is when we take a look at inclusion and neurodiversity and we take a look at systems, it's about creating universal design principles and deploying universal design principles. So let's look at a simple analogy that a company installs a ramp for wheelchairs. Okay. You install the ramp to solve one problem that you particularly have to make it easier for your employees or customers to come into the store. But unknowingly to you, a few months later, you start to see parents with push strollers pushing their babies up and down the ramp because it's much easier than go up and down the stairs. You see elderly with their walking strollers using the ramp because it makes it easier than going up and down the stairs. You may see if you have a daycare in your company, and you see parents bringing their kids on their little bikes to come in. Again, it's much easier to go up the ramp than to go up the stairs. So when you thought you were solving one problem, you end up solving many problems. And for the cost of solving one problem, you end up for that same cost solving all those other problems. So you need to take a look at your system. You need to take a look at what policies and procedures and tools that you could put in place that will solve not just one problem, that will solve everyone. And when you may think that you're solving one problem, but unbeknownst to you, by default, you have solved a lot of other people's problems. So let's say, for example, I walk into your company and you hire me, and I inform you I'm dyslexic, and I say I'm going to need something like Grammarly to help me with my writing. Okay, you make an investment for a annual business subscription with Grammarly, which costs a minimum cost of, let's say, 300 euros a year. Now, when you're getting it for me and you get a corporate account, you're thinking I'm the only one who's going to use it. But 6 months down the road, you find out that 20 other employers are using it. Now, they may be neurodiverse, they may not be. But in the end, they needed a tool to help them become more efficient in their job and more productive. And again, by solving and helping one person, you end up helping 20 other people. And that's where universal design principles come into play. It's thinking about how can we help individuals that will help other people and being more inclusive and support them. And it's the same thing when we take a look about focusing on strengths. If someone's doing very well in a particular area, let's focus on that and help them scale that and not put so much attention on where they're having difficulties.
Just take a pause here. So welcome Ruby, welcome Harihi, and ladies and gentlemen who's listening in to this live show, or if you're listening to the recording, if you've got any question at all to Joseph, please type it into the chat, or even if you're listening to it, post the live presentation. You can always put it in the comments, and between Joseph and myself, we will seek to answer all your questions. Yeah. So we have with us here, Joseph from Malta, who is an expert in neurodiversity, and we have been talking about, what does neurodiversity mean, and then how is it applicable in the workplace. So I guess the next question we're gonna go to is the application. Can you share some stories about how companies have embraced neurodiversity in their workplace? Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, right now there's a great awareness of neurodiversity, and that a great awareness is coming out of because of the pandemic, where a lot of neurodiverse individuals again have said the system is broken and hasn't been working effectively for me. It's a lot of neurodiverse individuals are burnt out of trying to fit in and to meet the expectations of a neurotypical system. So we're starting to see a lot of a great awareness happening. And for example, when we take a look at the immediate action that was taken during the pandemic of work from home. Now that's a little bit of a funny situation because the autistic community, for example, has been arguing for years prior to the pandemic that there's a need for them to be able to work at home and not have to be at the office because their home has been built for them to be more effective, and it takes a lot of energy to be able to walk out the door and to be able to commute and get into the office. So what would you rather have? Would you rather have an employee show up at the office at 40%, or would you rather be able to work at home and be at 100%? And
naturally 100%, yeah.
Exactly. And the pandemic has shown us how the ability to work from home is effective. And it's still more effective, in particular for those who are neurodiverse. So the one aspect in that regards in stories is let's allow the neurodiverse to have that flexibility to work from home, to be more effective. And, other stories, we're looking at just recently, I've done a speaking engagement with one of the big gaming companies here on the island, Betson Group, where they see and feel the need for more neurodiversity awareness within their companies. So I spoke to a room of HR and managers who are engaged in asking questions in regards to what can we do to be more inclusive. And that's where, again, neurodiversity design principles, correcting or developing the system, creating champions, following these simple neurodiversity principles of being people-centric, being flexible, focusing on strengths, supporting challenges, being reflective, and most of all, being patient. And now, as a result of that speaking engagement, I've now been invited again to come in for another speaking engagement with Betson to speak to more of not only their staff, but other iGaming companies on the island in regards to neurodiversity awareness. We're also seeing across board many companies taking on more neurodiversity awareness and more neurodiversity policies and procedures into their companies because they recognize that a great talent has been excluded or not allowed to reach their full potential. So we can see, for example, Microsoft as one example as being a big company. But we're also seeing, even smaller companies that are adapting and employing those strategies where even human resources are changing how they need to approach human resourcing in regards to their staff and neurodiversity talent.
So from the way you are sharing, there is a movement towards incorporating neurodiversity as a plan versus it being an afterthought. And I suppose what we don't want it to be like companies doing it for the sake of doing it, like the what's it, CSR or trying to be inclusive because there is a quota. We need to how many of these people, how many of that people into the workforce. What's your comment about that?
Well, that's a very good question. Definitely, we cannot have a check the box approach. When you're changing the system, when you're looking to be more inclusive and diverse, you really have to ingrain it in your mission statement, in your company values. So when you say you're going to do something, you do it, check the box, and then you go beyond. And you make sure because in the end, your employees are going to feel it. They're going to see it. They're going to say, yeah, okay, yeah, I took my neurodiversity training, or yeah, I tried to communicate with my manager, and in the end, they kind of said, okay, not a problem, and then continued on with the same behavior.
Okay.
And that brings another aspect, which I'll get back to in just a moment. So it cannot be a check a box approach, because if your employees are going to feel it, then they're going to know that in the end, they're not going to get the support that they need. They're not going to get the resources that they need in regards to management or Grammarly. And in the end, they're not going to put the effort that they want to put in, because if the company's not going to invest in me and the company's not going to take inclusion seriously, then I'm not going to be serious about working for the company. And they're either going to burn out or they're going to end up leaving the company. And when we take a look at costs, I mean, first off, the cost for inclusion is either 0 to minimum 1,000 euros. Some research shows even less than that, about 0 to 500 euros. And when we take a look, there's sometimes the attitude of let them leave or let's just fire them. Now, there's been a study done in regards to providing reasonable accommodations. Again, reasonable accommodations is providing something like Grammarly.
Okay.
The study had found out the purpose of the study was to debunk the myth that it was too expensive to adapt and provide reasonable accommodations to someone who's neurodiverse.
Okay.
And what they have found out from the research was that the cost for providing reasonable accommodations or adapting was 7% of what it costs to recruit and onboard a new employee.
Oh.
So we'll let the phone ring. Let's say, for example, it costs 5,000 to replace, to fill a role. All right. To replace me. What's more cost effective? To spend 5,000 or to only pay or to only spend 7% of that 5,000 to keep me on and provide reasonable accommodations?
Obviously, the 7% is more cost effective. Yeah.
Obviously. So I mean,
Yeah.
that's the particular things that we need to overcome for businesses to it cannot be a check a box approach. You need to have a proper system in place. You need to have a holistic approach where you're looking after the client when they join the talent, when they join the company, and throughout the whole entire journey when they're with your company. And I mentioned I'll come back to something I haven't forgotten, which is feeling safe to disclose. If the environment is not safe to disclose, many neurodiverse talent, because of stigma, because of shame, because of past experience of how they've been treated in a previous company or the current company, will not disclose that they are ADHD or dyslexic or dyscalculia because of that fear and how they've been treated. So we need to create a safe environment where they can disclose.
Okay.
And then with that, there's a caveat to that as well, YP, because why should I disclose? There's a bit of a backlash going on against disclosure now, which is, again, why should I disclose? If you had created a proper system where I was included from the very beginning and provided support, and that you were able to adapt to me from the very beginning, then there's no need for me to disclose.
True. Yeah. There's nothing to disclose when it's all open, transparent, and yeah. Okay. So Joseph, you're coming up. In fact, we've just exceeded the 30-minute mark. So, what would be your parting words to companies that are looking to start embracing neurodiversity in their policies, in their values, in the way they run the companies? What tips would you give to them?
Well, again, the principles are very simple, and it starts from the top. The culture starts from the top of the company. Somebody from the top of the company, the employer, the owner, the CEO, has to be willing to take on the cause to become inclusive. Find someone who's a neurodiverse, who can become a neurodiverse champion, and work with that top management to be able to bring out this message and to bring out the awareness in training. Then we need to train managers and human resources. Let's in place a neurodiverse policy and procedures and make sure that it's ingrained in the company's vision and values. And lastly, it comes again back to those 6 principles of neurodiversity inclusion, which is be people-centric, focus on the individual. What are their needs? Be flexible, focus on their strengths, support their challenges, be reflective. In other words, be reflective with your behavior and how you communicate to them, and take the time to engage with them. And lastly, be patient. If you follow those simple 6 principles, you can be inclusive.
It doesn't sound difficult at all. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to get in touch with Joseph, so I've just popped up his website there, and this is where you can get hold of Joseph. You've got more questions about neurodiversity, about the concept of being inclusive and have neurodiverse people in your team, and tap into their talent and their alternative, or say no, I wouldn't use the word alternative, their different way of thinking, and in any situation we always want different perspectives, isn't it? And that's what makes a company strong. Okay.
And
so,
if I may, if I may wipe you quickly, I also will do a shameless plug. On my website, you can find my podcast, Take a Leap and Transform, a Neurodiversity Journey, where I provide many of these solutions and from business professionals on how to become more inclusive in your place of business.
Okay, thank you so much. Good. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening. As a way of saying thank you to you, if you've not already downloaded this book, This is an Amazon bestseller, but I'm not asking you to go to Amazon to go and buy a copy. I'm just asking you to go to this link here. You can take a picture of it, or you can see the QR code up there. Take a picture of the QR code, and you get a link to download this book for free. Yeah. So this is 10 proven strategies to work less and more. And this is what I do. I also help business owners to work less and more. Right. So today was a very exciting show with Joseph. We got another one lined up for you next week. Right. Now, last week's show was canceled. I would say postponed because I was done with COVID. This is actually day 8 of COVID for me. And I'm about 80%, recovered. Right. So next week, we're going to bring the guest that was supposed to come in the previous week. And there's Dante. And next week's topic is, basically, do you have a slice of the metaverse? If this is one phrase that you're not familiar with, or you've been curious about what the metaverse is and how, what's his name? What was that? Pirates of the Caribbean, Johnny Depp, right? I just saw on the news that he sold an NFT for $800,000, okay? A digitized painting, and he donated it to a hospital, I think, or a children's home in Perth, okay? So if you're not sure about what metaverse is, what NFTs is, what the new real estate is, come and join us next week, and I'm sure you're going to learn a lot from our speaker next week, okay? So with this, I wish everybody a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and I'm going to see you next week. So Joseph, join me in saying bye-bye to everybody, and we'll see you next week.